Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? Monoclonal antibodies. You might remember monoclonals from way back at the height of the pandemic, when both President Trump and later Joe Rogan revealed that they had been treated with them for COVID. Monoclonals, as they're often known, are lab-created versions of the antibodies your body makes naturally. They're designed to help your immune system fight off and, in some cases, prevent disease. So why are we talking about them today? Yes, we'll absolutely explore the science. What's the real promise of this technology that honestly is already being used by millions of people? They are, of course, pricey, so what's next? How much of a game changer could it be for millions of immunocompromised people? And what about for diseases we haven't yet conquered? But monoclonals sit somewhere smack in the middle of our great divisions over health. More specifically, over the idea of preventing a disease versus treating one. Many people who are otherwise skeptical of vaccines embrace monoclonals. Why is that? And how should we think about promising innovations for treating disease at a time when more and more Americans are deeply mistrustful of vaccines? It's good that we have two great thinkers today because we have a whole lot of questions. Marc, Elia, a leader in the world of monoclonals, and our good friend, Dr. Michael Mina, are both here. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, welcome, everyone.
Hey, guys.
Hi, everybody.
So we have a really interesting topic today. It definitely gives off some sci-fi vibes, and there is a little PTSD from the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
It's got a dollop of our sort of prevention versus treatment culture wars that we're often finding ourselves in. You know, it's got a little something for everyone. But first, who are we? I am Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Marc Abdimalik.
Yeah, so welcome. Everyone knows this is a podcast all about the breakdown of trust in science and where that's leading us. And of course, contact us at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. We read all of your messages. Thank you for what you've been sending. And last reminder, head over to our Substack, subscribe. There's a lot more of the program happening over there.
So like we said, we're going to be joined today by Marc, Elia, and Dr. Michael Mina. Listeners of the show know Michael, and Marc is the chair of the board for a company called Invivyd, which is all about monoclonals. He also says he suffers from long COVID, so he's had a difficult journey coming out of the pandemic. There's a lot of ground to cover with both of them. But Tom, what the heck are monoclonals?
Yeah, I was asking the same question. Okay, but who is watching the Winter Olympics? We sort of skipped that.
Whoa, wait.
Okay.
I'm watching figure skating and downhill skiing.
Okay. I like the hockey.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a point to this. Monoclonals are like hockey. Actually, that's not true at all. They have nothing to do with hockey. But I think we have a way to maybe explain this because I was working on this while watching some hockey over the weekend. All right. So let's say you're the coach of Team USA. And let's say you're playing Canada. And I think Canada's like the favorite for the gold this year. And actually Team USA is pretty good. So this could be interesting. But anyway, so let's say Canada has the best offensive player in all of the Olympics in hockey. And this guy's a beast. He's a super scoring threat. He's a scoring machine. And to make matters more dire for your team, for Team USA, your best defender, the guy you'd put on him, is out with an injury. So this looks like a disaster in the making, and you've got to find a way to stop that Canadian player from basically shredding your defense and scoring at will. So you huddle with your coaching staff, and you look up and down the bench, and you conclude you just don't have a player who can match up with that Canadian offense. And so you decide to make a clone player, one with all the defensive skills of your star defender player who's out of the game.
Whoa.
And not only that, all of these defensive skills that you're going to bring to your clone player match up directly with the offensive skills of that Canadian star player. So the puck drops and you put on the ice the clone who skates around and pretty quickly comes across that Canadian offensive player. And then your clone, like any great defender, latches himself on to that Canadian star scorer. So everywhere the Canadian skates, the clone skates. He smothers the Canadian. He checks him. He breaks up passes to him. He deflects his shots. He is on this guy. And basically, the star Canadian scorer can't even get a shot off on goal. And so when the third buzzer goes off and the game is over, the best threat in all of the Olympics has been stopped. He didn't score. And the clone, well, he was only designed really to last for those 3 periods. So he heads off the ice or he dissolves into the ice and the Zamboni gets him. I'm not sure what, but he's out of there. And of course, okay, so the clone defender, that's our monoclonal antibody put into the game by the coaches when they faced a threat for which they didn't really have an answer. And now you can think of those doctors who put monoclonals into your bloodstream to thwart the threat that your system is facing when your body doesn't have the defenses to defend against a threat like that. So the monoclonal treatment or the clone hockey defender has all the qualities needed to mount the best defense possible to reduce that threat. And, our clone player, like a monoclonal, latches onto the threat, disrupts it, blocks it, other defenders to come to help, and ultimately, hopefully, neutralizes the threat before disappearing.
Wow.
Okay, that was kind of amazing. The idea of a clone player also, it's like if hockey were to meet Blade Runner, were to meet Heated Rivalry.
Oh, man. Get us Netflix.
This is everything.
Tom, that was amazing. I'm going to give that, in the spirit of like scoring you, that's a 10 for creativity right there. That's pretty badass.
I think you're doing skating.
You have a small deduction for a little bit of accuracy, but I'm going to let it go.
Only small?
Small, very, very small. And the only small thing that I would say is that like you can't have almost like any advance warning. And this like clone player has to just like appear. He can't come from the bench, because he came from the bench. That would be like a vaccine. He has to just kind of like appear like amazingly. And that's the monoclonal antibody. But that is a gold medal in immunology for Tom Johnson right there. Gold medal. But let's just do a quick recap of how our immune system gets going. Okay. When we get sick, our body has a built-in mechanism to fight off that infection. How? First of all, our body has to know something went wrong or a foreigner has invaded. And if it can, and it knows how to, it creates proteins. Those are the antibodies that you've heard so much about. Antibodies latch on to and neutralize, kind of that same language that Tom was using. And they do more than that. So they latch on, they neutralize, and whatever is making you sick, they're going to rally other immune system cells to come in and take care of that. And our immune system has multiple lines of defenses. So we have reinforcement cells that help cells make antibodies. We have like Navy SEAL kinds of battalions of cells that kill infected cells. We have direct precision attacks, and after all that's done, like we just went through this horrible situation with an invader, our immune system has like one final special trick up its sleeve. It's like a photographic memory of everything it sees, and it stores it in a time capsule, so that if you were to happen to, encounter that little thing again, it would have memory and take care of it. Now, everything we just described, none of that is science. All of that is just Mother Nature at its finest, your body working its magic. Now, we're going to enter some science into this. So the strategy with a vaccine is that if you give a vaccine, it triggers many of those same immune defenses that we just talked about, but without making you sick. And it works really well, but you got to plan ahead before you get sick. And because our immune system has that, time capsule, photographic memory, call it what you want, a vaccine that you'll get today can protect you in the future. And that has to be a good vaccine, one that's designed well, that can actually give you that kind of lasting protection. And not all vaccines are created equally. So how do monoclonal antibodies fit in here? So monoclonal antibodies, the clones that Tom talked about, they're made in a lab. They are tiny proteins, maybe big proteins, but as far as proteins go, but to the naked eye, they're very tiny, that are modeled after an antibody your own body would naturally make. So think of it as like this precision target missile that your body is manufacturing. They're designed to recognize one specific feature of an invader. So mono means one, clonal is from clone. So we're talking many identical copies of one specific antibody designed to do the same thing that your body was already going to do anyway. But unlike vaccines, remember you have to plan ahead, you can give monoclonal antibodies with a little less planning when there's a reason to give them. Say like you've been exposed to something, or just got diagnosed with a cancer, or you have a really severe allergy like a peanut allergy. So they're not usually for prevention unless you're at high risk of catching something. So unlike that, they kind of more fall into like the therapeutic area. So doctors give you these antibodies usually through an infusion or an injection And once in your body, they kind of like go around scavenge hunting. They circulate in your bloodstream looking for that virus, looking for that bacteria, looking for that cancer, looking for that overactive cell. Maybe it's the cell that's causing you to have allergies. And when they find their target, they again, let's hold this latch on and then block it from doing bad things in your body. Or like, if you parked it illegally and then the parking authority comes by and they slap a tow you sticker, they might slap a tow sticker on your cell. And that like tells all the other people around, hey, this one's not so good. And they signal your body's immune system to come in and finish the job.
Man, I love what you guys did here. I wish I had heard this 10 years ago, because when I was talking about how antibodies work, it was not nearly as fun. But like Marc said, once the monoclonal antibodies are attached, they can go to work based on the threat. So for viruses, we think about them attaching to the virus and blocking it from entering your cells so it can't replicate. This allows you to prevent or even reduce illness. Antibodies can do a lot of other things, but this is the primary mode of action for monoclonals. And this is how they worked, for example, in someone with COVID during the pandemic. For cancer, they attach to the cancer cells and they may stop the cancer from growing, deliver a targeted therapy, or like Marc said, flag them so your immune system knows to attack the cells. And for autoimmune diseases, they actually work by calming down an overactive immune system or changing the messaging that's going on that allows for some of those severe symptoms that we see.
So these monoclonal antibodies, they have been around for a short amount of time, but they have become a core part of modern medicine for all sorts of diseases. Like you got to get your head out of, oh, it's just for COVID or if it's just for respiratory diseases. It is for so many things, autoimmune diseases, cancer, severe allergies. I mean, someone I can almost guarantee is probably on one of these drugs. You've heard of them. You've seen them advertised on TV. My nephew takes one that has opened up his world because he has a very rare condition and he is now thriving because of a monoclonal antibody kind of miracle. My niece just started one in the last year, an injection once a month because she had life-threatening allergies to peanuts and she takes it. Again, these have been game-changing and a kind of miracle for so many patients.
Yeah, and if you don't have a friend or a family member who's come into contact with monoclonals, a lot of people, it came on their radars during COVID when two specific individuals received them as a treatment for COVID. And that was President Trump and then Joe Rogan. And, during that time period, for some Americans, monoclonals quickly became seen as a cutting edge treatment option, which might have meant like less urgency to go get vaccinated. So we'll talk about that with our guests in a moment.
Yeah, I mean, a key difference here, and there's a little bit in the weeds, but with monoclonal antibodies and vaccines, like that's often a distinction that's talked about. Monoclonals don't wait for your body to like figure out what to do. They arrive and start working on the threat immediately. They also, unfortunately, operate in your body for a shorter period of time. But vaccines, on the other hand, they can kind of give you long-lasting protection. So it's like a 1-2 punch, if you will. Another difference is price. The monoclonals are very expensive. This is really advanced science, highly, evolved technology, labs that are complex using different parts of animals to create human antibodies. And right now, it's expensive and it can be sometimes just a treatment for smaller and more vulnerable populations. But with advances, and if they can scale this, it can actually be something that many, many more people can have access to. Now, the pharmaceutical companies do charge a lot for them, but there are also many patient assistance programs and copay things that can really help bring down the cost for people.
For acute infections like RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, this virus is dangerous in infants and the elderly. And it's come up a lot as we've seen the changing in the vaccine recommendations. And what we see for pregnant women is we give them the vaccine to protect their newborn from RSV. But infants can also be given the RSV monoclonal antibodies when it's time for the winter season. And this gives them protection for those months. So it's not an either or question, but they can be layered on top of each other.
Okay, y'all, I just got a pretty nice, juicy, meaty monoclonals 101. But, a big part of this, and we said this up top, is like monoclonals in a way is sort of an allegory for this moment we're in as we're talking about treatment versus prevention, skepticism around the medical industry, around vaccines. And I'm really excited to speak with our guests about that. Not only the sort of cool, interesting science/hockey of monoclonals, but also kind of this moment that it finds itself in. So when we come back, Marc, Elia, and Dr. Michael Mina. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back, and a big whiskety welcome to Marc Elia. Marc is the chairman of the board of Invivyd, a biopharmaceutical company focused on developing monoclonal antibody platforms. He has held the position since June of 2022, during the height of the pandemic. Prior to that, Marc spent his career in investment, finance, and health innovation. He says he's especially proud of Invivyd's work, advancing technologies that offer protection to the millions of immunocompromised individuals who live under constant threat. Hi, Marc.
Thanks. Hi, it's great to see you and great to be here.
And we're so happy to welcome back to the show our good friend, Dr. Michael Mina. He's been on several times. Michael is an epidemiologist, immunologist, and physician. He's been an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, as well as the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He led America's Test to Treat program during the pandemic, and he served as a scientific advisor for many health startups. Nice to see you again, Mike.
Likewise. Thanks for having me back.
So, Marc, take us back to COVID. Tell us about your experience with COVID and how did it change your outlook and really move you into this work?
Yeah, happy to. So for the first parts of the COVID pandemic, I was, I think, a motivated observer like everybody, trying to understand what was going on. And I would say as a professional in the both biopharmaceutical industry and then in finance, my first inclination is always just to learn. And so, believe it or not, I had a few weeks in which I read at my kitchen table most all of the abstracts you could find in PubMed at the time that mentioned coronavirus. And would you believe there were only I think there was 6,500, which sounds like a lot, except, you spend 2 or 3 weeks marinating in that and it sort of breezes by. And I finished that work and I thought, well, we have a big problem here. And so it motivated me and a bunch of others to start to think constructively about the role monoclonal antibodies could play for COVID, both then and on a go-forward basis. I got involved in what is today Invivyd as an investor, actually, at the time. And then, of all things, in November of 21, one of my children brought home Delta COVID. And I experienced what I think a clinician would call mild to moderate COVID, which for those of you that had any of those early strains was, it didn't feel all that moderate from time to time. It felt a little more harrowing. And then ended up later with, on about day 9 or 10, bilateral pulmonary emboli. I ended up in the hospital. And in the time since, which is now going on 5 years, I would say I have been on a slow and fitful recovery from some of the classic features of a long COVID. So thankfully, mine's relatively mild, right? I am not bedridden and absolutely laid low like a lot of humans, but there's a fair amount of dysautonomia I experience in my normal life. I used to be an athlete, and now if I walk on the treadmill for 30 minutes, I start to struggle a little bit. So, that experience set overlaid onto the ordinary stuff, I would say added a certain level of, let's say, personal resonance and intensity to the work we do here. Because I think, as a company, what's so important to me, and I think so important to us, is to be vigorously and relentlessly pro-human and anti-virus. And the rest of the noise is to us noise. So that's the perspective I think it sort of brought to at least my work.
Marc, let me go back to something you said, which is that when you were kind of swimming in these 6,500 PubMed studies, that you saw that there was a problem. Now, to me, the problem that there's a virus out there, it really affecting people and hurting our country. But is that the same problem you saw, or were you seeing a different problem?
Yeah, I think you could certainly see that, but you could see some deeper, let's say, mechanical features that might make you wonder about how we were going to deal with this. So I can recall vividly when I read a paper by a guy named Jeff Shaman at Columbia, who's an epidemiologist, and his paper described the seasonal reinfectivity potential of the then endemic coronaviruses. So for those of you that want to think about it in simple terms, he was asking the question, how many times in 1 year would a human be likely to be infected by those original 4 coronaviruses all of us have been dealing with? And his data, you could almost think of as like a photonegative of your immune system function, right? So he would observe that you would undergo an infection, you would be protected for some amount of time, and then that protection would rapidly wane. And so you would then have the potential to be reinfected. Now, why would that strike me. It would strike me, I think, on a couple dimensions. First is, I don't think we're all just going to face this once. Second issue is, as a general statement, and I'll be careful to caveat this as a general statement, if an infection doesn't give you durable protection from subsequent infection, it is relatively unlikely that a vaccine, which is a simulation of that infection, would give you a protection that is any different in time. And so I looked at it all and I thought, well, we need to get through step one here, which I think America actually did beautifully. We got through step one, but it led me to believe we are going to be in a very unhappy long-term equilibrium with this virus.
Do you think that the coronavirus vaccine was a good vaccine, like it was an effective vaccine?
Absolutely. I think you said it beautifully. It was a good and effective vaccine. And I think the confusion about that is sort of fun for me to think about, only because I think everyone's a little right. So when we saw non-evasive variants, pre-Omicron variants, you could expect, I think, to take a vaccine, get the immune education you needed, and experience a very, very significant reduction in your risk of even getting sick. Those are the data that are today on the vaccine labels. Something changed that, even at the time, the CEO of Moderna took a look at Omicron and said, well, there's no world in which our vaccine will be as effective as it once was. That's a great article you can read in the Financial Times. Nobody remembers this stuff, but of course he was right. And why was he right? I think these are mechanics that Michael Mina and Maggie Bartlett would understand well, right? You drop antigenic sites off of a virus that the immune system likes to target, it essentially becomes, I don't know, the viral version of a stealth fighter, right? It's not as recognized by what you would ordinarily wish to use to recognize it, right? So those antibody titers that come out of your original vaccine. So what has happened in the time since? I think all of us have empirically noticed that they don't work like they used to. And that is not because of somebody or some political party or some perspective. It's just the hardwired facts of a really unique host pathogen evolution that occurred over a very short amount of time. What ended up happening is the humans changed, all of us, from immunologically naive to then experienced. The virus responded, and that's sort of the tale of the tape. So yes, I do think they were extraordinary. And yet, speaking as someone who's very, very worried about COVID just personally, I don't actually use one because I know there's limited risk, but I also perceive relatively limited reward at this stage in our human interaction with the virus.
Michael, just picking up on that and just moving it to sort of our societal story as it comes to COVID and it comes to monoclonals and it comes to the vaccine. It seemed like for a lot of Americans, they've come across monoclonals, because they have a relative who is sick and this is, offered as a cutting edge treatment. But for a whole lot of Americans, they heard about it for the first time during the pandemic. And they heard about it because Donald Trump got a monoclonal treatment, or Joe Rogan, revealed that he had been taking monoclonal treatments for COVID. And it sort of landed in this battle between, prevention with the vaccine versus I don't want the vaccine, I'll just treat it because there's ways I can treat it so I don't have to take the vaccine. Can you just talk a little bit about, what goes through your mind as you think about Americans who sort of view monoclonals perhaps as an alternative to vaccines? I mean, where do you think is the right way to fit monoclonals into that way of thinking about disease and prevention and treatment?
It's an interesting question to ask. Are monoclonals considered sort of a replacement or a surrogate for vaccines versus a treatment? And the interesting thing for monoclonals is they're both. They are a treatment for infection. They're also used for prevention of infection, which is not unsimilar to vaccines. In fact, it's an exogenous approach to giving a lot of the same types of biologics that a vaccine creates in our body. And so I don't like to think of them as like a one or the other. As an example, we have a tremendously great monoclonal antibody on the market that is explicitly used in lieu of a vaccine for infants against RSV. A lot of pediatricians even call it a vaccine, but it's a monoclonal antibody, and it works tremendously. It's built by Sanofi, and so we have these Pemgarda, which is the monoclonal that Invivyd makes, which Marc is the chairman of. That actually has a label for prophylaxis, which so that means we give the antibody before somebody gets exposed, in order to prevent them from getting sick if they do get exposed, which is effectively what vaccines do. The big difference is one has the potential to have persistent responses in the body that could go out years or decades, like a measles vaccine, and one is going to necessarily disappear after a number of months. And the monoclonal antibody just can't persist in our body for more than a number of months. And what that means is that for a seasonal virus, if somebody's in a position for whatever reason they can't get a vaccine or they don't want to get a vaccine, if there was a monoclonal that could provide some of that same protection and get you through sort of an acute season, like a 4 or 5 month COVID or flu season, for example, or RSV season, then there can actually be massive potential benefit there. And so societally, like I see why people are kind of putting these in the same bucket, and they kind of do in a way go into similar buckets. And I think having more options on the table is a good thing. Monoclonals, I've always said, are like a remarkably strong and effective therapeutic or prophylaxis because our body deals with monoclonal antibodies extremely well. They can persist for a long periods of time. They have very, very, very few downsides, and our body makes them in abundance. The antibodies inside of our body are one of the most abundant proteins in our blood. And so that means that if we can kind of give our blood a little bit of assistance, which is just like what moms do when they pass antibodies to their babies as in utero, it's literally passing antibodies into the baby, and that gets them through their first 9 months of life, which is really, so we're kind of just like recreating that with monoclonals, which I think is a pretty fantastic option.
Yeah, and Marc and Mike both, I want to give a even more blunt kind of version of Tom's question, which is if someone out there is really nervous about vaccines and they're like, but monoclonals don't make me that nervous. Are you sort of in this place of okay, well then take the monoclonal? And what happens when that conversation, because I can imagine some folks from public health listening being like, okay, I'm not okay with that. You got to take the vaccine. And I wonder, Marc, can you take that first and then Mike follow up with that? So my question is, when somebody wants to use it as a substitute for vaccines, what goes through your mind?
Well, the first thing that goes through my mind is I certainly hope they have that choice. And when I think about how you characterize the internal narrative of the theoretical public health apparatus saying, I'm not okay with that, you must take the vaccine. Gosh, I sure hope that's not the thought that goes through most public health officials' minds these days, because I think we are tempted in some of these questions to combine a few thoughts that maybe should be picked apart, meaning people who are vaccine hesitant, let's say, or even vaccine skeptical, I think the first big mistake a lot of people make is assuming that their thinking is somehow perverse or irrational. And I think if you can actually consider some of the thoughts they think with empathy and imagine it comes from a place of informativeness, you might imagine somebody sitting back and thinking, well, if you can offer me the choice between supplementation to my native immune suite, meaning I may be full of antibodies, but I may not quite have the right and best ones yet, but I can access them, or you can expose me serially to a piece of a pathogen in the hopes that I suddenly acquire such a thing, which is really mechanically kind of what we're distinguishing between. I don't know how to make one choice superior to, or let's say, more prone to being, mandatory than another. They both will have their role. And so I think our work exists to try to guarantee that as many people as possible in the future have that choice.
And Marc, you've been called anti-vax before.
I have?
Isn't that what you told me?
Did I tell you that?
Yeah.
I think our company might have been.
Okay, so Invivyd's been called anti-vax.
So, I think that's I think that's like a little disappointing along exactly these lines, right? I mean, I think in a lot of quarters, right, sometimes progress can be viewed with hostility or suspicion. And in this case, I mean, my goodness, we are all operating in the 300-year-long shadow of Edward Jenner and the magnificence of vaccines. And then we're operating in the 6 to 7 year shadow of this human cataclysm that traumatized a generation and confused a lot of Americans. And, I was chatting with someone the other day, and when they said, well, don't you think this will all go away, all this confusion at the next election? And I thought, no, because, 25 years ago, some guy tried to light his shoes on fire in an airplane to set off a bomb. It didn't even work. And for the next 25 years, every American took off their shoes at the airport. So, I don't think this is all going away. I think it reflects a very real learning opportunity and some growing pains as we consider not just the unbelievable gift that is vaccination, but also some of its important limitations and how we and, companies like us, hopefully, can illuminate a path forward in which people don't need to feel marginalized or penalized for making a choice about what they engage with in medicine.
Mike, do you have a thought on that?
I do. I think the fact that we're even asking this question, are like monoclonals somehow viewed by the public health establishment as like anti-vaccine or vice versa, I think is just it's a symbol of our times, I suppose, which is really what you're getting at. And should it be on the table? Like, absolutely, it should be on the table. There's a lot of people who are unwilling to get a vaccine right now for any number of reasons. Those people shouldn't be without options, And I would say, and monoclonals shouldn't be seen as sort of an escape route for vaccines. It should just be seen as another option. And in some places, maybe a better option. Some places, maybe a worse option. Like if you're going for very long-term immunity against measles, then a monoclonal antibody isn't going to give you protection 30 years later. But if you have a kid who can't get a vaccine, in the middle of a measles outbreak, and there were a monoclonal antibody for that, or a child who's under 7 or 8 months, for example, of age, and there's ongoing measles, then a monoclonal antibody makes so much sense. For an adult who just is choosing not to get a vaccine for any number of reasons against COVID because they aren't working, as in terms of their marginal benefit, they're not that great at this point. For a lot of the same reasons, maybe a monoclonal will actually outperform during a particular coronavirus season, the benefits that somebody might get for a vaccine. So I think it's really interesting that this is even a discussion, that somehow this distinction has become political, or that monoclonals are somehow viewed in the same light as sort of vaccine hesitancy. I view them as another remarkable innovation in healthcare. I definitely agree that it's great to have the options. I think Marc said it well. It would be such a shame if we didn't have both options. And we're seeing right now the contours of where vaccines are limited. And that also opens up new opportunities for all sorts of things in healthcare and public health.
I think part of our show is looking at, how do we move forward? And I think if we need to maybe think about how we even look at this, like framing, a medical science complex discussion as like a consumer choice, I think that really sometimes just misses the whole point, right? They're not competing products. They're, it's a complex science, layers of protection, how does biology work? And it's not just about personal choice sometimes, right? You can't just have a false question about personal choice when it's sometimes so complex about how we even got to that crossroads. So, but I think that's a really good point for us to think about how we move forward in a world where we can have both as options. And we do. Marc, I think we need to take a step back a little bit and try to understand where the world is headed. Where is science headed with monoclonal antibodies? So you're the chairman of the board of Invivyd. And can you tell me, where do you see the biggest opportunities to make a real impact on patients' lives? What is the frontier that we're at right now with this?
Yeah, happy to. So I think, most physicians and most sick people are familiar with monoclonal antibodies as medicines. And I think in the intro, you guys referred to several categories where you would see medicines today. What's sort of ironic, given what an antibody is how relatively underdeveloped the field is for monoclonals in infectious diseases. So we have all, I think Michael referred very nicely to a competitor's product in RSV. But in fact, the first monoclonal antibody for RSV was, I think, approved in 1998, palivizumab, and it does a lovely job of protecting infants, and the state of the art has only gotten better. So to our eye at Invivyd, we are evaluating all of those contours that I think all of you have been referring to, right? Where can you see a pathogen that inflicts a toll on a human subject that could be disrupted, either in prevention or in treatment, and maybe down the road in even like some of the long phenotypes, right? You know, whether it's long COVID or somewhere else, where maybe chronic infections that are difficult to diagnose might still be driving morbidity and mortality after an acute infection. So how do we do that? Well, we actually don't think first in modality terms. I mean, it's not like you can simply take any pathogen on Earth, look at it and go, well, let's build a monoclonal, right? You can start that way, but you very quickly run into some of the same limitations that vaccinology runs into. Some of these things seem to be a little more tractable and responsive than others. We view SARS-CoV-2 as an incredible target for monoclonal antibody, both prophylaxis and therapy, because it is itself relatively responsive, at least to our antibodies. So again, it's sort of horses for courses, right? Michael referred to the durable protection that follows from a measles vaccine, and he's absolutely spot on. And of course, there is glorious, deep, mechanistic data that supports that. But there might be other use cases for a monoclonal, for example, in measles. You could treat an acute infection, perhaps, with something very specific, one would imagine very safe, and not driven by sort of the best we can do kind of empiricism of vitamin A or IVIG, so on and so forth, right? So all of I think we love being in the business of trying to bring forward monoclonal options because Mother Nature invented this category, right? Not us. All we're trying to do is provide human subjects with just a little bit more or a little bit better, either before they get sick or after they get sick and need to get better, or again, maybe down the road when they're dealing with a long-term chronic infection. So if you were to look at the materials we routinely discuss publicly, right, you would know we ourselves are working on RSV, we're working on measles, and in fact, we are starting to consider all of those very interesting places in which an antibody could synergize with.
Do you see measles as a threat worth investing in at this point?
Well, I must, right? So yes, I think it would have been the sort of statement that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, but is no longer unthinkable. And so when we see the cadence and pace of outbreaks, right, I can worry, I think justifiably, about the burden of disease, both from an acute standpoint, but also, and this is where, again, the good Dr. Mina is an expert. So I'm going to choose my words very carefully and then watch his face to see when he judges me. But I think there are so many still to be determined consequences of acute measles, both sort of proximal to the index infection and then long-term. It would be a shame to watch herd immunity continue to wane and not have a specific medicine we could offer that could help disrupt what is still a very, very real infection with, even if it's low frequency, some extraordinarily unwelcome consequences for a percentage of people.
Can I make a comment on that too? You know, for years we've been talking about there's a real lack of therapeutic options for measles. So let's take a big step back and just think about measles, not in the context of new outbreaks in a country like the United States where we had elimination and now we don't or won't soon. But across the world, we have huge numbers of measles outbreaks, and people who study measles have lamented the fact that we don't have treatment. So in lieu of or in the absence of monoclonals to treat, what we do is we actually pool people's blood and their plasma, and we try to extract just like antibodies that other people are making with the hopes that there's good antibodies in there, and then we just kind of like give those to kids. Like that's kind of like one of the best treatments, and it's pretty mediocre. And so, I bring that up because I think the world and measles experts who have, worked on trying to both eliminate measles and also treat measles for decades would welcome an antibody against measles that was actually therapeutic, rather than like what we do today, which is kind of take a shot in the dark every time we give somebody IgG, like antibodies that are pooled from lots of other people. It's pretty mediocre and sort of last ditch effort that we give to people.
So let me understand this, okay? I'm a little slow on the uptake of all these scientific words. So in the measles conversation, I see a couple of things happening. One is we have, these pockets of outbreaks all over the country, and people are really nervous about low vaccine uptake in these areas, right? And then you've got people who, once they get measles, there's the sort of like effect, the acute effects of it afterwards, the chronic effects of it afterwards. I guess my question for you, again, and I hate to keep harping on this, but I really feel like it's important to nail this down for our listeners, is one of the things that companies like Invivyd, Marc, is doing is like, look, there are these awful viruses out there. Vaccines are a great mechanism to either prevent, in some cases, treat, prevent transmission, in other cases, not so good. And what monoclonals do is supplement that care and make it better, make it, make your immune system that freaking like gladiator that it can be, that we all know is in us. And or are we saying, look, we know that these vaccines make you nervous. This is something your body kind of already produces. Kind of like, when Kennedy was like, take vitamin A, it'll like cod liver oil, all this stuff. Like, are we sort of in that framework of like, if you're not going to take the MMR, like help me understand? Because on the one hand, I'm so with you of like, these are things that can supplement and boost and make better. And on the other hand, I'm like, are we in this case saying if you're nervous to take the MMR and you're not nervous to take this because it'll strengthen your body? Marc, you take that first.
Well, I think you nailed it with your first version of what's going on, which is because I think your second concept of if, that gets into an area of, I know that your podcast discusses well, which is the sort of public health apparatus. And there's an aspect of, if you'll, forgive the gendering, sort of paternalism and herd management in that sort of posture. I don't see that. Meaning, if you can believe it, and it is true, so you should, the reason we started a measles program is actually because HCPs asked us to. So
what's HCP?
Sorry, a healthcare provider, doctors. Okay. So whatever we think about everyone's choices out there, all I know is if technology can provide some relief from a potential consequence of a choice, I don't know how to be anything other than thrilled to try to provide it. So again, you're asking what I hope is an innovator and an entrepreneur a question that I think other people are best or better left to answer, meaning about what one should do. But I would simply observe, if COVID hasn't taught us this clearly already, I think it may have exhausted what little temperament was left for a very large portion of our population being told what to do. And I don't think I have to tell you that. You guys run the podcast called Why Should I Trust You? So all of that complex is unfortunately built upon trust. I hope our tools, for example, someday, if we're very successful, could be a big part of regaining a certain amount of trust, right? But I think of it more in terms of an option to supplement that. Yes, we do very good work, I think. Yes, we avail ourselves of some trick technology, but in the end, our pharmaceutical product is sort of what you describe. We are trying to improve upon something you might already have. We can give you more. That's the good news is we can think about developing that for all kinds of use cases. To my eye, they're all valid.
Let me ask you guys a question. Have either of you seen data that makes you think the mRNA COVID vaccine was riskier than what the sort of conversation in establishment science has been, which is everything has risks. The risks were minute. This was a very effective vaccine. It had limitations like any vaccine, but the risk, this kind of fear that there's like this brewing risk about mRNA. Have you seen anything that supports that fear?
I mean, the reality is no. Like we've seen the mRNA vaccines be very, very effective and safe, particularly during the emergency that was COVID-19, the early days of the pandemic, the first few years of the pandemic.
Right.
But that risk balance equation does start to change a little bit as the vaccine, as we've all developed such great immunity at this point, relatively speaking, the virus
Yeah, I
is
get
going
it,
to
but
keep doing it.
still incremental. It's not.
Yeah.
But
I think one thing I would say is, that there were those early markers for potential myocarditis, particularly in
sure.
younger men. And I think that, it was kind of a little bit, it was blown out of proportion in some angle, like, corners of the media. But nevertheless, the one thing I do want to say is there were a lot of people that were reading those corners of the media and were reading that there was actual real signal of myocarditis. And for those people's view or their concern to be kind of neglected by the majority of the establishment, I think didn't do anyone any favors. Like we should own it. We should say, yes, this is actually happening. This is what the real absolute risk is. And this is why we're still recommending it. Instead, we had what we saw was a lot of the public health establishment try to bury it and say like, no, that's not real, until finally, like over time, it had to come out like, yes. And in fact, as risk has gone down and down and down of COVID because of immunity getting built up over years, we have to take into account this question, like, does that risk of myocarditis still exist in individuals, And the point is, I think that's one of the only ones but the reality is we haven't seen big risk.
Yeah. So this is my question though, because it sort of gets at the climate around innovation, sort of what Marc is working on. We've seen mRNA, the federal funding get cut. We've seen, ACIP now is sort of signaling that they are going to really go at the COVID vaccine, the mRNA vaccines for safety issues. We've seen the FDA saying they're sitting on data they haven't put out, but it's proving that this was very dangerous for kids. We haven't seen the data maybe that supports that level of, or anywhere near that level of mRNA is turning out to be bad or dangerous. But yet here it is, this up and coming technology, this platform is being basically torn down. So Marc, you talked about sort of clouding out the noise and just focusing on the science. Like, what does that climate say to you as an innovator?
Yeah, I really appreciate it, because I think, there is an originating issue, I believe, in all of this. And you asked the question, have I seen any data to make me believe something? I think one of the challenges is, by virtue of, I think, necessity, we're all operating in a data vacuum. By that, I mean the following. I don't think anyone, I've never met a either COVID or spike proteinophile, somebody who just loves it and says, get me more of that in injectable form at any opportunity, or through an authentic infection. I'm cool either way, right? So we don't have those people, and I don't think we ever will. When we consider the mechanics of pandemic response, you got to remember something. In terms of controlled, truly placebo-controlled data in a seronegative population, meaning people who have never seen virus and they've never seen vaccines, at scale, from the original Pfizer and Moderna field studies, you have about 7 or 8 weeks worth of data. That's it. And by the way, don't hear that as a critique of that. It's not. I happily vaccinated because I'd sure rather take a vaccine than risk death. Now, we go through that process, and by virtue of the mass vaccine campaign and then subsequent circulating virus, we are left in perpetuity with no control group anymore. So if we're all doing something together, it's hard to know what it does and does not do. And into that vacuum, I think people are semi-entitled to look at anecdotes and generate a thought around, I shared earlier, I don't vaccinate because I think I know the data that tell the good Dr. Mina, of whom I'm a fan, and I think he knows that it's very low risk. I don't know how to interpret words like that because I could use a number that would tell me just how risky it is in order to make a rational determination. And I think what we have missed in 4 years of arguing about this issue has been what I think the US FDA has recently moved to do, which has not been, I don't think, a particularly positive or at least well received by the vaccine complex initiative. Please go retest in a randomized placebo-controlled context the overall profile of these vaccines. Now, is that going to reopen and relitigate pandemic decisions? I sure hope not. Because, like I said, under those circumstances, I think the reasoning was beyond sound. Okay, so a lot of us are very fortunate to be alive to complain about all these things. But over these last few years, you can actually start to ask the question, to Michael's point, well, how well do they work? How well can we quantify the risk? And what does the net risk benefit look like? The safest answer I can give you on those points is I don't know.
Marc, I think what you're talking about, this data vacuum is, something that plagues science all along, and making decisions when we have limited information. And I think, Tom, what you were talking about is, this threat to an innovative technology like mRNA and what that could mean, right? If there's a threat to mRNA technology, the very questions that you're asking may not ever get answered. But just turn the lens just a little bit back on yourself for the monoclonal antibodies.
Yeah.
And 10 years ago is a very different world of monoclonal antibodies than we are today. The advances have been dramatic. If you were faced with the kind of cuts to monoclonal antibodies that mRNA is facing now, where would your company be? What kind of ecosystem would you be facing if you were in that financial pressure that we're seeing right now on mRNA? What would have happened to the monoclonal antibodies if the same thing happened to them?
Absolutely nothing. We've never actually been the beneficiary of any government funding or any pandemically mobilized monies. So, I think you could cut it by 99% by comparison, and we'd be way ahead of the game in terms of where we are. So what about the industry?
What about the industry of monoclonal antibodies?
I think it is a vibrant and incredible ecosystem that has actually, in effect, bootstrapped itself by making medical value. So, look, if you have a solid tumor, Keytruda is a boon. And it earns revenue for pharmaceutical companies. And I think, for example, Merck has a long history of trying to make impactful medicines. So I'm not trying to dispute the premise you're describing, but I also know many of the companies that brought those vaccines to market have budgets that are, oh gosh, I couldn't speculate, let's say a lot bigger than Invivyd's. We are currently running our third sequential placebo-controlled RCT in 4 years. And so I guess if I sound unsympathetic, it's only you've got to appreciate the vantage point of a company that hasn't benefited from any of that mobilization, and we feel just fine about that.
Well, but is that because there isn't an interest? Is there a sense? Here's something I want to zoom out on. One of the things that Rogan said during the pandemic was that, and I don't know if this has any basis in fact, but he said that that the Biden administration was actively trying to dissuade people from taking monoclonals because they were afraid that it was going to be a replacement for the vaccines. And of course, we talked about cost being prohibitive and all that stuff. But I guess my question is have you picked up on during the Biden administration or even the Trump administration that there is that they're not interested in monoclonals because they view it as somehow being characterized as a replacement for vaccines?
So I think I can safely say we felt some of those vibes. I don't know that nobody renders a direct communication, but I think I wrote an op-ed about roughly this topic in the Sick Times a couple of years ago, in which when I talk about that long shadow of Jenner and the long shadow of COVID, I mean, a guy I know you've talked to, Paul Offit, I think says it well, even though I don't agree with a lot of what he says. I think his point of when you mix politics and medicine, you get politics. I think he is spot on. So, I do believe that we had slightly tougher sledding in an administration that was making a sale to the American public called boost, test, treat, boost, test, treat. To acknowledge a limitation in that at the time, I think was a little harder. So there was this election. I think the sentiment of the country had been shifting, and I don't want to over-index on politics because I actually think some of this is more populist. It's what the people are thinking and saying nowadays. I perceive a great deal of openness to contemplating alternatives, and I hope that openness finds its way through the government complex, through HHS, through FDA. We're not a political organization, right? I don't, participate in that dynamic, but I do think it is safe to say that having controlled in effect, and I'm using air quotes because I think anyone who thinks they're controlling a virus is out of their minds, but having emerged from the politics of COVID pandemic, meaning Biden took off his mask walking through the factory in Detroit and suddenly it's magically over. I will at least say I think the amplitude of the rhetoric is dropping and the openness toward contemplating alternatives has increased. And I got to say, I hope in HHS and FDA that openness continues because I think the people are speaking. Just to be clear, whatever you think about vaccines, whatever you think about monoclonals, I haven't met anyone who prefers being sick. And I haven't met anyone who likes COVID. So I hope we are afforded someday equal consideration and equal footing as a really interesting, important complement and or substitute, whatever people decide in the end, because that's what I see as the relevant science here. And that's also, by the way, the water's edge for us as an innovator. We don't prescribe social policy. I hope that we make tools that are so intrinsically attractive. People think, yeah, that's better. And I'm so relieved to not be fighting about all that crazy stuff we were fighting about and trying to chase our tails through that data vacuum. Let's go this way. That would be the goal of our company. And again, a personal goal for myself, because I don't want to see this thing again. And if I do, I'd love to have a little support around in my serum.
Marc, I just want to hit on, well, your company didn't receive funding from the government during this time. A lot of monoclonal antibody companies did. There were billions of contracts for specifically monoclonal antibody treatments. And I wonder, the federal government was really absorbing a lot of that cost during the pandemic. Now that we're back to a more normal market, who ultimately pays? Who's at risk of being priced out? How do you envision that as you're continuing to push new ones forward? Yeah,
look, now you're getting to the very heart of the logistics that we're trying to execute over these next couple of years. Because I think I hope ongoing regulatory openness to considering these sorts of things, our goal is to scale. Why would we want to scale? Because you can bring costs way down. The medicine we commercialize today, you can think of as a Model T. It is rare. It is much more expensive than we would like it to be. And yet it's a really critical basis for establishing something that people told us years ago, even just a few short years ago, was impossible. Most of the companies that exited monoclonal antibody world didn't do it by choice. They did it because Mother Nature exited them at high speed. We have a slightly different technology. We have a different plan. And I think empirically we're pretty good at it, but it gets really interesting to more people when we can partner up with not just the government, but every aspect of the care universe, from individual HCPs, vulnerable humans, societies, etc., to simply make a simple point. If we can reliably prevent this infection, or if we can treat it effectively, a lot of medical value gets created. And the more medical value we create, the more energy we can put into scaling up production, bringing down cost, and making things accessible. And certainly I'm well on record in our investment world as saying we are aiming at something that is only a pretty modest turn above vaccines in retail price. That is our goal. You'll have to all bear with us because it has not always been an easy road, and there have certainly been a great number of regulatory bumps along the way. But at the end of the day, we live in our minds at Invivyd in a future in which there is no particular barrier between humans and supplemental immune support. Because, again, barring something I don't know about right now, I don't see a better, more convenient way to blunt the consequences of seeing this virus. And it may be true in the future for other viruses as well. That's our business. That's the goal. And I know, the perception around monoclonals is that they're very expensive. Already, our current one is at the very, 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 very low end of what most pharmaceutical mAbs are. And that's as it should be. We are selling protection to the, yes, medically complex, but also remember the well. No one ought be sick when they take our medicine. So our job is to lower all of the barriers that we possibly can to make the choice to avail yourself of extra protection as straightforward.
So I want to ask you both a final question, and it kind of spins off of what you just said, Marc. The name of our show is Why Should I Trust You? And Marc, you sit on you're the chair of the board of this for-profit company, publicly traded company. You answer to shareholders, presumably. And you're ultimately our listeners to be like, all right, well, this guy's selling a product. So of course he's going to want to tell us how this product is so great, right? And Mike, when you hear Marc, talk about MAB and stuff, like, I want to ask you both, like, why should we trust Marc and Invivyd in this moment when so many people are, questioning for-profit motives in, the betterment of our health? Why should we trust you? Marc, you go first.
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone should trust us. I think, like anything in human life, what I hope people do is watch us and decide whether or not we earn your trust. The way we would do that, I hope, would be to be relentlessly accurate, pro-human, transparent about our work, transparent about what we hope to offer, and allow the world to see as much data as we can share, as thoughtfully as we can present it, and go from there. So again, I don't mean to question the premise in your question, but I think the notion of someone showing up and explaining why they should be trusted is like literally the root itself of distrust. So I just hope people watch us work, read what we write, hear what we say, and make up their own minds. And, we'll measure our effectiveness by how much of your trust we earn.
Mike, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think this is where data comes in. We need to see data on all of these things. And I think being honest and open about the data is super important. And that's how physicians gain trust. And, by inference, that's how patients of those physicians will gain trust as well. And consumers, I think, outside of the physician land. And so continuing to provide data is going to be crucial. And the other piece is we need I think we need almost a correction in how the media presents some of the data. As an example, like we just need to stop having sort of biased presentations of data, particularly around, we've seen it across the board. I'm not talking about monoclonals here. I'm thinking about vaccines, but being able to put all of this stuff in context for physicians, because physicians aren't always the most savvy of people to understand some of this stuff. And they're looking at media, they're looking at the way that papers are kind of reported in the discussions. And we just need to get down to what does the actual data say? What's the absolute benefit? What's the relative benefit? And what are the use cases? And when we can put all those pretty simple building blocks together, I don't think we necessarily need trust as much as we need to look at biology. And you don't have to trust a pharmaceutical manufacturer. You just have to, and probably nobody should. But Marc is making a face. There's different motives, but the most important thing is, does the thing work? Does it work for what you're trying to do? And if you're trying to stay healthy and the thing works to keep you healthy, then don't trust the people, trust the science and the biology behind it. And, it's just really important for shows like Why Should I Trust You? And the mass media and others, including like the medical journals, to really try to dispel some of the biases that we're currently seeing, and to try to just like help the average doctor or the average consumer like get down to like bare facts.
Well, that is why we bring folks like you on. This was such a interesting, riveting conversation. I learned a lot. I'm also going to watch more Olympic hockey thanks to Tom Johnson, and I'm going to be seeing little antibodies on the ice. But just a huge thank you to Marc, Elia, and Dr. Michael Mina for joining us on Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure, and it's great what you guys do. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda.
So that is our show for today. Please leave questions, comments at Why Should I Trust You? I am Brenda Adhikari. He is Tom Johnson. She is Maggie Bartlett. He is Dr. Marc Abdulmalik. And we will see you right back here next week.